Hello, welcome to SOCI 360 Social Movements. This is my first video. I'm going to try to keep these videos short, down to about 10 minutes or less. And in this first video, I simply want to introduce the course to you and think about these first week's readings. What you're reading this first week is basically an overview of social movements from the Introduction to Sociology textbook, a first chapter from our, I guess you could call it a textbook. It's really more a trade paperback. It's not a textbook per se in the same sense that textbooks are defined, but I'm just calling it our textbook because it's our main book that we'll be reading from each week in the class. The title of the book is Social Movements and Global Social Change, subtitled A Rising Tide. This was a book written in 2014 by the author Robert Schaefer, and there's a short video describing Schaefer's accomplishments in the videos this week as well. There are basically two things I'd like you to take away from that first chapter, and that is that over the last 200 years, there's been a movement across the world away from dictatorship and authoritarian regimes, such as kingdoms, toward democracy and self-rule, rule of the people, by the people, for the people. That has happened not only, of course, in the United States, the United States being the very first example of a country that chose that form of government in 1776, but it has happened throughout the world in many, many different countries. Nearly all countries today are republics. A republic, which comes from the Latin res publica, meaning the public is king. The general trend has been toward, over the last 200 years, more democratic decision-making in countries worldwide. We do see backsliding today. I think 10, 12 years after the author published the book, he would be astonished. Maybe we should contact him and see what his take is now on the democratic backsliding that has been happening in the United States and elsewhere across the world in democratic societies. So, in any case, the rising tide seems to be lowering somewhat right now, but it may rise again. We don't know. The whole idea of studying social movements is to understand how people have addressed social change in the past in order to try to understand better what might be coming in the future. But certainly nobody can predict the future using any kind of social theories, and we shouldn't attempt social engineering in that respect. Okay, so that's the first message that I want to get across in our main book for the semester, the textbook, if you will. The second message is the types of movements that have developed as a result of this democratization trend. And Schaefer argues that there are three types of social movements. Those three types of social movements are called aspiring movements, altruistic movements, and restrictionist movements. Make sure you know the difference between all three before the end of the week, and also the degree to which the different types of actors within these democracies, citizens, denizens, and subjects, relate to those three types of movements. The citizens have full rights within a democratic nation: the right to vote, the right to work, the right to collect Social Security, for example, in the United States, when you retire, and so forth. The denizen is a person who is not quite able to access all of the rights. For example, women before 1920, when women earned the right to vote through social movements. Before that period, women were denizens because they didn't have the right to vote, although they did have other rights that other citizens had. Subjects are those who have relatively no rights. Subjects in a nation are again, in a former period of the United States, slaves would be subjects. Slaves in any society would be subjects. Residents of a kingdom under an authoritarian absolute king are subjects. They're referred to as the subjects of the king because they have no rights, no power of self-determination, no agency. So those three types of actors or people who live in a society have changed in the number and amount drastically over the last 200 years, with a larger number of citizens growing and the smaller number of subjects decreasing over the past 200 years in almost every country. It's quite remarkable, actually. So those types of movements relate to those who are trying to gain rights or restrict others from gaining rights, or perhaps people who have rights and want to help those who don't. That describes, those three descriptions describe the aspiring, restrictionist, and altruistic movements. There's also a video about types of movements, and this basically outlines a famous Eisenhower matrix or diagram that describes the range of who is affected by a social movement, from individual to the whole society, as compared to the degree to which that social movement is trying to change society, the degree of change, high or low. So if you have a high degree of change in an individual, a movement that tries to change individuals into somebody else, change their identity perhaps, that would be called a redemptive, or sometimes just simply called a religious movement. This type of movement is often tied to religious cults, who, for example, the Moonies in the 1970s was a cult where I believe they were asked to shave their heads and wear robes and so forth, things that you don't normally do in everyday society. And of course, observe the absolute power of the great leader. So that kind of cultish behavior would be called a redemptive movement. You're trying to redeem the individual by changing entirely their social behavior. If you try to change the entire society in a radical way, high degree of change for everybody, that's a revolution, right? That's where revolutions happen, and societies ultimately just change entirely in their structure, their institutions, and that changes everybody in the society. If you have a low degree of social change for an individual, that might be called an alterative movement. So alterative movements try to alter an individual in a small way, change their behavior a little bit, like stopping people from driving drunk. The movement of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, is an example of an alterative movement trying to change in a small way, small degree of change for just individuals. If you're trying to make a small degree of change for the entire society, that might be called a reform movement, like the right to vote for women. That basically is a large number of people, but it's a small degree of change. It's just one issue. So that's a reformative movement. So know those different types of movements and how they relate to that matrix of the degree of change, high and low, and the who's being changed, individual or the whole society. That's, again, redemptive movements, revolutionary movements, alterative movements, sometimes referred to as alternative movements, and reformative movements. So, know those four types of social movements as well. Okay, I'll leave it at that. We've got cars buzzing by and birds singing and dogs barking out here in my back patio where I'm shooting this, so hopefully I can edit this down to about 10 minutes and I'll have it up and running very shortly for you. Thanks. Have a great first week and have a great semester. Look forward to seeing you again in next week's video.